I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
Those who are most marginalized know the most about the truth, the good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm Dean Detloff, a PhD student at the Institute for Christian Studies in Toronto.
And I'm Matt Bernico. I teach media studies at Greenville University in Greenville, Illinois.
Today on the show, we're talking with my friend and my ICS colleague, Kiegan Irish, about a really great blog post that he did, / essay, I guess, on the Ground Motive, which is a blog, departmental reflection board. I don't know, it's a lot of things, but it's run by our school, and it hosts different writings by students and professors, and I've written there, and it's a really, really awesome reflection on anarchism and Christianity with respect to a specific anarchist action that happened nearby Toronto in Hamilton, Ontario. So we'll let Keegan explain more about that in a minute, but before that, we've got a new iTunes review, and that's the kind of thing that gets me super excited. What's going on there, Matt?
Yeah, we've got 2 iTunes reviews. That's nice. We've been sort of in this drought of reviewless episodes, and here we are. We got reviews now. Okay, so 2 reviews. The first one is titled, "This podcast is good, and when it's bad, it's very good." 5 out of 5
nice.
Stars. I guess it's a good review.
It's bad like in that 90s version of bad.
Ooh, it's bad. Bad to the bone.
It is bad to the bone. I had a poster when I was a kid from the live-action 101 Dalmatians movie that said "bad to the bone."
My dog, Spider, she has a collar that says "bad to the bone."
Oh, nice.
More like snuggly dog to the bone. Cool. Anyways, this person says about our podcast, "I wanted to come up with a very good comment, but I put so much energy into the subject that I got nothing left. Perhaps if the capitalists weren't stealing my creative spirit, I could do better. But you should listen to this podcast. Matt and Dean throw up the alley and help you oop it on reactionaries, or at least cross them up with segues. Hashtag Joel Osteen." I believe that's a basketball metaphor.
Yeah, I can see why all that creative energy got mixed up on that bad line. So
Yeah.
We got a lot of mileage out of it. I'm not complaining.
No, it's good. It's good and bad, but also good.
It's so bad it's real good.
That's right. Cool. The next review is just called "Forward" and 5 out of 5 stars. This is nice. Look forward to the show every week. Good to hear that good revolutionary praxis from fellow Christian socialists or socialist Christians or whatever folks want to call themselves. As Mao would say, combat Joel Osteen. Solid.
I remember reading that.
Yeah, it's in the Red Book. It's like it's one of those quotations from Mao.
It's actually in the Big Red Book. Most people just have the Little Red Book, so it's not a more well-known quote. But real Mao purists, they know about the Big Red Book.
Yeah, that's true. I've got it on my shelf. It's so huge, I needed its own shelf.
Bear in the Big Red Book. It's my favorite show as a child.
Oh my gosh. Mao in the Big Red Book was also my favorite show as a child. It was on Nick Jr. Cool. Great. So thanks for those nice reviews, those good 5 stars. We're going to take those stars. We're going to go to the star bank. We're going to cash them all in. And we're going to give that money back to the people. I think that's how iTunes reviews works, where you kind of can cash them in.
It is.
And redeem them. They're like Chuck E. Cheese tokens or something.
Yeah, we can get ourselves some revolutionary finger traps.
Some sticky slap hands.
That we can use to steal more stars, expropriate those stars.
That's right. Cool. Well, before we just jump into the conversation we're about to have with Kiegan, I do want to say something about this. Earlier in the week, I made a dumb mistake, and I posted our Magnificast design that was on all the cool T-shirts a while back onto Teespring, a website which now I have a very low opinion of. The idea was that we were going to sell like stickers with that logo on it, the Magnificast logo, and then Teespring was like, "Hold on there, fella, that design looks like it belongs to someone else. It's someone else's intellectual property, and they will not let us now sell it." So this is why capitalism is actually really stupid and bad. In case you didn't know. Because it's actually, it doesn't really belong to Dean or I. Somebody else made it for us and just told us we could use it. It's kind of, a complicated situation. Property doesn't work the way they think it does. But anyways, there are no stickers to be had at the moment, and that is a huge bummer. However, Dean and I are looking into some other sort of avenues for the production of stickers and T-shirts that is ethically sourced, or as ethically sourced as anything can be under capitalism. So just keep an eye out.
It's extremely hard.
Yeah, it is so hard.
Speaking of which, we've emailed like 3 or 4 t-shirt companies already trying to work out exactly what the production is, that whole situation. And if you know of a very cool t-shirt maker that will print our shirts and ship them for us, please don't hesitate to tell us.
Yeah, it's crazy. Just want to get people paid the right amount of money and get T-shirts that aren't made in sweatshops, but it's really difficult. Cool. Well, yeah. We'll update you all in the future on that extremely pressing and interesting matter of property rights and Teespring. Cool. Well, let's turn it over to Kiegan. All right, well, as advertised, today on the Magnificast, we have Kiegan Irish, the author of a really neat article on groundmotive.net, which is the ICS blog. The article is called Christian Reflections on Locke Street Anarchism, which is kind of a meditation on some direct action that happened in Hamilton, which we'll talk about in a second. But before we do, let's just catch up a little bit. So, Kiegan, what have you been doing?
Hey, man, I've been working a lot. I've been just working on my thesis. I'm a master's student at ICS here with Dean, so it's been a bit busy lately. I attended a conference this weekend. I presented a paper on it was about Foucault, but it was a philosophy of religion conference. So that was pretty good experience, actually.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. What was your paper called?
It was called How Christian is Modernity? And it was reflection.
Good question.
The subtitle was like governmentality and pastoral power, and the work from Michel Foucault.
Nice. That sounds cool.
Nice.
Yeah, it was cool.
Was it pretty well received, or was it just?
It was actually,
conference?
and which was I was a bit nervous because like I'd never actually done that before.
Oh yeah.
So it was a first time thing for me, but it went over well. People seemed to connect with it, and we chatted about it after. So yeah, it was actually pretty encouraging.
That's really neat. Cool.
Yeah. So what have you guys been up to?
Man, just been writing a bunch of stuff. I had a feature article come out in America Magazine this week, and then a bunch of stuff happened this week as well that I've been trying to report on. Keegan and I both live in Toronto, and there was a big, huge, massive event yesterday. This guy drove a van into a bunch of pedestrians here, which is a terrible thing. And when you're a journalist, you have to, I guess, think of some way to say something about that without sounding like a jerk or an idiot. Yeah. So I've been working on that. I'm still not determined if I can avoid those two fates, but that's my task right now anyway.
Yeah, that sounds difficult.
Yeah, it's heavy for sure.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's pretty wild. I did get a haircut though, which doesn't sound like a huge event for most people, but I get a haircut once or twice a year depending on how my life is going
Wow.
for an entire year. And today was the day, so I called up my barber, and he was like, I am at a different shop now, but you can come here. So
That's pretty cool.
yeah, how about you, Matt? What have you been up to?
I don't know, just dumb class stuff. It's the end of the semester for me, and I'm like grading a bunch of stuff and administering final exams, and I don't know, all of that good stuff. Class will be over in like 2 weeks though, and that's going to be a really good time. Yeah, I'm gonna do nothing for days, so gonna be sick. Yeah,
Awesome.
yeah. Well, cool. Keegan, could you tell us a little bit about the blog that you wrote? We usually just ask people to give kind of an elevator pitch of what their project is, so maybe you could give us that elevator pitch all the way to the top floor.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so I wrote the piece a while back, like right after the event first took place. The event being there were some anarchists in Hamilton, and on March 3rd at night, I don't know, it was maybe like 10 or 11 at night, they walked down Locke Street, and they were carrying this banner that said, "We are the ungovernables," and using, stones and that sort of thing, they broke a bunch of windows, and they set off these kind of firecrackers, and after vandalizing some storefronts, they dispersed. So it was an interesting instance of anarchist direct action, and there was a lot of backlash kind of right away. And so my piece is meant to respond to some of that backlash, especially that I saw from Christians. I think that in this case, a lot, it's sort of, I guess I would kind of qualify what I'm about to say in that one of the things that's kind of become apparent to me between the time when I wrote this piece and when it actually ended up being published is that there was kind of like a wider diversity of Christian responses than were sort of apparent to me at the time. But I felt compelled to kind of write something and say something because it seemed as though a lot of Christian voices were lacking in serious analysis of why this action took place.
Yeah, I think that's great.
Mm-hmm. And okay, so I'll just quickly run through what I said, and so I talk about gentrification and what is it. And so gentrification is sort of this process of where folks are displaced for groups who are considered to be more desirable. And part of the argument of the piece is that this is violence as well. And so while that the breaking this windows and this kind of thing is violence, there is kind of this deeper violence that's taking place through capitalist expropriation. And so I think that churches are often not willing to dwell on the kind of these fault lines. And when something like this happens, they're very quick to want to reassert the status quo. So I have in the piece a reflection on Jesus and the story from the Gospel of John, where Jesus enters the temple and turns the tables from the money changers and drives them out with the whip and calls on them to stop turning his father's house into a marketplace. And so I reflect on this action in the context of the social world that Jesus was operating in, where there was this kind of agrarian society that had been urbanized, and so there's this way in which there's kind of an urban class who's capitalizing off folks who are coming to the temple to sacrifice. And so when Jesus chases out these money changers, I read this as kind of showing us that Jesus' ministry is disruptive and that it is aimed at overturning established order, not like in a peaceful way, but in a way that ultimately leads to the cross. And so I like where this story shows up in the Gospel of John because it's right at the beginning of the Gospel, as opposed to in the other three Gospels where the story actually comes up at the end. And so here it seems to me that this kind of disruptive aspect of Jesus' ministry, this attack on these kind of established hierarchies, is foundational for his ministry. So I end the piece by calling on Christians to kind of dwell with the complexity of the situation before they jump to conclusions or solutions or condemnations.
Yeah, I think it's really a cool piece, especially because, so like Keegan was just saying, the event happened in Hamilton, Ontario. We both live in Toronto, and so there's a lot of kind of buzz about it, I guess, kind of just around where we live. But even more than that, it's interesting because it's weird to watch Christians respond to societal violence and I don't know, actual political decisions. Like Christians kind of don't seem to have a way of figuring that out, which is ironic, as you point out in the in your post, because Jesus had some ideas about that.
Definitely.
So maybe to like get into that, and so folks can kind of understand it beyond the kind of general terms, we could just think about the local bit first. Like, could you describe a little more about the situation in Hamilton, and like why did the Ungovernables march on Locke Street specifically? What's the symbolic or like practical value of that part of the city?
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so in answering this, I feel like I may say some of the most controversial things I'm going to say because it's just a very contested story about like what is the history of somewhere like Hamilton. But in kind of broad strokes, Hamilton was previously like a very kind of industrial working class city, and it has been really hollowed out, and there was like economic collapse a few decades back, like in the 70s and 80s. And the downtown, just a lot of the people who lived there and the businesses just kind of fled because there wasn't anything for them there. But what this did, this whole kind of economic collapse, was allowed for property speculators to move in and buy up significant amounts of property at a very low value and basically just leave them to rot. And this created opportunities for other people to move in. And so Hamilton is kind of especially famous for the arts community, who moved in to and established itself in the context of this kind of dilapidated city. But they eventually had to become economically viable, and so these galleries and artist studios had to create an industry around themselves. And so slowly they kind of attempted to clean up the city, and especially like the first few business owners and this kind of thing would work with police to create an environment where folks would feel comfortable coming to galleries and this kind of thing, which pushed out a lot of the people who had been living there, who were, kind of destitute and forgotten by the larger capitalist form of organization. But so as this kind of vanguard is cleaning up the city, that allows for other small businesses that are legitimately profitable to begin to enter in, like cafes and bars and restaurants and that sort of thing. And so once that happens and these businesses begin to organize amongst themselves, that kind of signals to, and they advocate for different improvements around the city. That signals that for the big developers that it's time to act. So part of what's complicated about gentrification in Hamilton is that the kind of hip artisanal character of a lot of these businesses and organizations actually provides cover for the agenda of these larger developers. And so Locke Street is symbolic because it is considered sort of the economic success story of the city, but at the same time, almost the entire street is owned by a single capitalist, right? So I think that is why, besides probably its proximity to these folks, like I think that it has that symbolic value as well.
That's a pretty helpful inroad then. Well, okay, so you say in the article that you're not an anarchist, and that's fine. You don't have to be. But you were trying to figure out like what was being said in the property destruction on Locke Street, like what the sort of communicative content of that direct action was. Well, what do you think it was? What was revealed in the events on Locke Street? What happened, or like what comes out because of the direct action that took place?
Yeah. It's a good question. So the reason I was so interested in it is just because this event hit really close to home, both kind of literally and figuratively. And I guess it just seemed the way that a lot of the communities were responding, where they were saying that it was senseless. They were describing it as senseless a lot, and that really just rubbed me the wrong way. And I that drove me to want to understand and to kind of make sense of what I felt like other people were refusing to make sense of. And so I think that what is revealed, to come to your question, is precisely the fault lines between the moral discourse of revitalizing the community and of economic development. And so, yeah, the fault line between that moral discourse and the reality of people who are being displaced, the reality of the violence of police. And, and following it, we see these protests and there's reactionary violence and all this kind of thing. So it really, I think that the action did cause those fault lines to bubble to the surface that this discourse of urban revitalization wanted to bury.
Yeah, that makes sense. I love that so much too, because as we've talked about a few times on this podcast in the past, what seems like senseless violence, it's not like there's no real sense there. I think that's a really important instinct, I guess, that you had. Yeah, I guess that kind of leads me to ask, like, why do you think that Christians don't have those instincts? Or, like, is there something in Canadian or American Christianity that makes it hard for Christians not to just jump to the defense of capital? Because in a real kind of way, defending capital doesn't really make sense either. At least it doesn't make any more or less sense than attacking capital, as you write it in your piece. So yeah, do you have any impressions on that, kind of as you've watched all those reactions unfold?
Yeah, this is a really tough question, and because I think it's a really large question about, is there something in like American and Canadian Christianity that would lead to the defense of capital. So I guess I'm going to approach it from two angles maybe. So the first would be that I think there is just the historical weight of North American Christianity, where it's deeply entangled with the history of capitalism and colonialism on this continent, right? And like Christianity is the religion of the settler, and it has been the logic which has justified a lot of the ways in which our societies have developed on the backs of, for example, like indigenous and black slaves. So I think there's that aspect where historically Christian identity is tied to settler identity and tied to capital. And so it's very natural for people to sort of fall in line with that. I think that's one side of things. On the other hand, I have maybe a less cynical reading about why Christians can be kind of duped into coming to the defense of capital. And I think that has to do with something about what it means to be a Christian and to kind of experience life as a Christian person. And one of the things that Christians do is to hope in the face of despair, right? In against all odds, like Christians kind of they'll hang on to hope. Christians will sing when you should weep, and I think that that's actually something very deep about what it means to be a Christian person. It's something that is incredibly valuable. But there can be a problem with that as well, where if we're not critical, then we can be too quick to jump to kind of moralizing conclusions, and then we'll be really susceptible to moralizing discourses. I think that if we don't sort of do what to use Paul's language, if we don't weep with those who weep, and we're too quick to look for that hope, then it's really easy to get caught up in the more moralizing discourses, which play a huge role in the way that specifically gentrification operates, right? This idea of like environmentalism or charity and so on.
Yeah, I think that's right. Well, here's an observation, or maybe like a weird question that will, I don't know, maybe lead us in some kind of direction. This is sort of off script, so we can talk about this as much as you would like, or as little. So something that's I think is kind of interesting about the sort of your report in the article is that Christians were like upset about this, about sort of the property destruction of a gentrified area. However, I think that at least in my experience and in my community, like there are certain types of property destruction I think that I could get like maybe like the most liberal Christians in my community on board with. Like, for example, I've told some of my students like this story about the Catholic worker women who tried to burn down the like Dakota Access Pipeline, and like the students I was talking with about this like didn't seem like they were had much of a problem with that. Like they kind of like understood that logic of property destruction. But I feel like there's something different going on here, where if I told them this story about Locke Street, they might be like, well, that's not exactly cool. So I wonder if there's like in some way too, like since it is sort of like the petite bourgeoisie kind of behind this, like the small, like the shop owners are sort of the receivers of this. Like we don't connect systemic justice in the same way we would in say like the Dakota Access Pipeline.
Definitely. And even just in conversation when I brought this up with folks and kind of like brought up a counter perspective, that it comes up so often, right? Well, like, oh, these people aren't part of the evil empire or whatever. They're just trying to like build this small business. And I think that, that's one of the things that's so deeply insidious about the process of gentrification, and especially like property speculation, is that it actually depends on people's like personal investment, right? In the sense that like people pour their life and their work into building up these shops and this kind of thing to create the environment for like more large scale investment that will in turn eventually push them out. And I think that that's what the artist community in Hamilton right now is seeing, where they really poured themselves into creating this art scene that is really cool and like has all this kind of wonderful stuff to offer. And then in turn that is beginning to be forced out, and you feel burned, right? Because you're like, I put in all this work, but you kind of wind up betrayed. And so it is tough, because I think most people, they side with the person who has done something really constructive and poured their life's work into whether it's creating a business or making art or whatever that might be. And so it is a lot more difficult to say, well, look, maybe there's another side to that person being attacked, Yeah, so it definitely makes the situation way more complicated. But I think that discomfort that people feel with those these kind of smaller, more personal businesses or firms or whatever shows that, or highlights that really kind of insidious element of the way that property speculation operates.
Yeah, that's a really interesting and enlightening sort of observation to make. Well, I guess sticking with that theme of kind of like staying with the tension and the uncomfortableness of property destruction from the left, to kind of grapple with that, you suggest that Christians just ask the question, where does the pain come from that would drive someone to do this, that would drive someone to smash a window? So I think that's a good question, and I think that's really, the right response to this. But I guess, how do we prompt our own friends and congregations and communities to ask these types of questions? What's the way in for this conversation?
Yeah, that's a really good question too, and a really like an important one, I think, because I kind of in the piece I just sort of throw it out there, but I don't offer like a strategy. So you're making me think about it now. Yeah, I guess just to reflect on it in general, as kind of a young person who's like been involved in church communities, I feel like I've been asked a lot of times by older people, like, oh, how do we kind of get young people involved with the church, and what's going to bring young people in, etc. And usually my answer to that, because they'll often be like, oh, would you guys like this kind of event or that kind of event or whatever? I'm like, I don't think any of these kind of weird outreach things are actually good at all, and or will be super appealing for people of my generation. But rather, so normally what I say when I'm asked that question is like, just like stand up for what's right. I think that so many people, if they have an issue with the church, it's like usually has to do with these kind of injustices that seem really, really glaring. And so when you see the church kind of going against the grain of like what you expect them to be doing, I feel like that's going to be way more appealing and like make people much more curious than having any kind of event. So I think like having these difficult conversations is really important. So the way that this answers your question is that as a strategy into how do we get our congregations, let's say for those of us who are already in the church, to talk about this stuff, we could demonstrate that it is aligned with their explicit priorities, which is like trying to bring people into the church, trying to build community. And if you could kind of play to that, you know what I mean, and say like, actually, some of this could be some of the more important stuff that you're doing if you'd want to do that kind of like outreach to younger people or something like that. And I actually hate the word outreach so much, but I'm using it there. Does that make sense? I don't know. What do you guys think?
Yeah, it is tough. It just makes me think of, we had John Thornton Jr. on here not too long ago, who's an actual pastor trying to figure this stuff out in his church. And I remember, he had some similar kind of sentiments, I guess, that, people are leaving the church a lot, and churches talk about their kind of membership problem as though it's this huge big mystery to be solved. But I remember John was like, well, if you like started paying off people's debts and stuff, you would have more people coming to your church. If you just actually did these kinds of things and thought really hard about like the political economy that you're in, maybe you would seem like a place that people actually want to be part of or something like that. But I don't know. Ideology is like a real life thing that I think just like forecloses people from ever getting there. So totally. Yeah, it's tough.
Totally.
Kiegan, at first I thought your answer was going to be like, oh yeah, well, outreach, just, if you have sort of a night where you can bring millennials together and like smash some windows, I think it'll go a long way.
Oh my God, so true. Yeah, we'll tell our pastors,
like what if we started like a black bloc Bible study?
Yeah.
Why not that?
Yeah, instead of "We Are the Ungovernors," our banner will say like, a verse from John or whatever. It'll be it'll be really cute.
Yeah, that's right.
So that night on Locke Street, you kind of report that there was some broken windows and also some other vandalism. One part that sticks out to me, one kind of piece of the vandalism that sticks out to me, because it is, pretty cool, is some words that were posted on one of the broken windows from the Spanish anarchist Bonaventure Durruti's words, slogan, I guess. We are not in the least afraid of ruins. We carry a new world here in our hearts. So you compare like that quote, that slogan, that extremely good potential tattoo that you'd have, to Jesus's words, the kingdom of God is within you. There's an obvious connection to these two types of things, and Christian anarchists have held on to the kingdom of God within you since, Leo Tolstoy 1,000 years ago. A few hundred, yeah. Not 1,000. He's not that old, but you know what I mean.
He's not young either,
Yeah, that's right. So yeah. He is between 100 and 1,000 years old. Yes. So, but anyways, like what can we make of these types of comparisons about this like sort of like internal feeling of like new world? It's kind of latent in Christianity, but also there in anarchism too. What should this comparison demonstrate about the similarities between Christianity and anarchism?
Maybe I'll just start with like a brief point of clarification, which is that So that slogan was actually written. So there's an anarchist community center in Hamilton called the Tower, and there was retaliatory violence against that community center by, I don't know, Proud Boys or whatever, some folks like this, some reactionaries. And they smashed the window there and went inside and wrecked it and, threw their library around. And it was when they put up boards on their own window that they wrote that. And,
I see.
Yeah, but the reason I bring that up is that one of the things that I contrast that with in the article that I thought was really striking was that, so the outside the windows on Locke Street, there were also a bunch of boards put up prior to those windows being fixed. And one of the things that there was all, it was like the wall of love or whatever, and people were writing these messages of love, which is nice. But one of the things that had been written by someone was that like an anarchist bookstore has no place in a cultured community, which was just like so disturbing to me that would be written. And I thought that the contrast was like so stark between, someone writing that these people are not welcome as opposed to the stuff at Durruti. So then I also, I went on to draw the comparison with Jesus, as you bring up. And so what can we kind of draw from that comparison? I think is an interesting question. And so I guess the things that really stand out to me, the salient commonalities, I guess, that like Christians have with anarchists maybe would be kind of coming back to that point that I made earlier, which is the hope against hope, hope in the face of despair. It seems that both anarchists and Christians sort of have to lean into that and lean into really like an anticipation and a tension between what they see as a broken world and what they hope for. And I know I'm sure there'll be anarchists who will push back against that, but I think that there's something to it. And while I don't think it's the same, I don't think that their way of sort of engaging, contemporary brokenness with respect to hope are the same. I think that there's something that sort of rhymes about those two temporalities or those two ways of engaging time. So that would be one thing. So maybe just building on that would be something that is in common with anarchists and Christians is that we both hold ourselves apart from the world and imagine other possibilities, right? And I think that there's a potential to have some really fruitful conversations about learning what both that future and what like the contemporary brokenness look like. Yeah, that would just be to kind of wrap that thought.
Yeah, I really like the way you put it where it's not necessarily the same, but there's something that rhymes. Mm-hmm. That just like strikes a chord with me really well. I'm going to use that. I'm going to steal it from now on.
All right.
Property's left, so now it is mine.
Yeah.
But talking about maybe like one more like cool rhyme, I guess, in the history of kind of Christianity and anarchism together. I was thinking as I was reading your piece about this episode we did, episode 26 with Heath Carter, who's a historian. He wrote a book called Union Made, and his book kind of traces like Christianity and Chicago's workers' movements, but specifically he mentions this really interesting letter from August Spies, who was one of the Haymarket anarchists in Chicago, and it really stuck out to me. So I'll read a little bit of that letter and then ask you a question about that rhyming.
Sure.
So this is like kind of a little bit long, but I think worth it. So Spies says, this is in a letter to his fiance before he's about to be hanged.
Damn.
He says, "You will probably remember the crucifixion of a young, bright, generous, and noble-hearted Jew by the name of Jesus. And in connection with this incident, you will likewise remember that a few days prior to his legal murder, he had entered the temple of Jerusalem, which he found occupied by the Board of Trademen of that city. And when the Jerusalem Board of Trademen saw their respectable business thus exposed by this foreign, half-distracted, wild-eyed, ranting agitator," that's all in quotes, "and when they saw that his words were listened to eagerly by the people, they formed a conspiracy, drummed up some charges against the lawless fiend, and crucified him as a convicted felon. You will readily see the analogy of this and our own case." So I felt like something that you were doing in your article was kind of drawing that analogy out as well. And especially when you talk about cleansing the temple, maybe we can do a little bit of work on that. Like, how does that kind of cleansing of the temple and Jesus's direct action sort of rhyme, I guess, without being the same as the actions in Hamilton, or kind of rhyme with these other sort of moments in like anarchist history?
Yeah. First, it's really cool that this connection sort of, especially with the anarchist action, predates my thinking, which I guess shouldn't be surprising at all. But that's a great, the way that he puts it too. I love some of his language, the Board of Tradesmen and the wild-eyed outsider. That's all actually quite wonderful. And there's something so beautiful about that being his letter to his fiance before he's hanged. Like, this is sort of in his final moments, and he has this vision of kind of almost walking in the footsteps of Christ. And, you know, we could maybe debate how legitimate that is, but I think there's a certain kind of like passion and beauty there that is undeniable. So that's wonderful. Thanks for reading it. It's interesting as well that so he's using, I mean, really any of the other three Gospels besides John, where that story does appear right prior to Jesus's execution, where that story is sort of the last straw, right? It culminates, Jesus' ministry culminates to this moment of cleansing the temple, and that is the thing that leads to his death. And that's very impactful. What I like about the John version in particular is that it comes at the beginning of the gospel, and that it kind of lays this foundation for Jesus' ministry. And I find the symbolism of that contrasted with that story as the last straw also kind of really fruitful, really evocative. And so this question of analogy, I think that is important to keep in mind, that it's an analogy, and that's something that I try and bring up in the piece, is that, you know, I'm not trying to say that these folks in Hamilton are literally Jesus or whatever, but there is sort of I think that that story of Jesus gives us a good like hermeneutic tool, or a good interpretive tool to understand what is taking place. So even if it's not a straightforward, one-to-one relationship between those things, and I don't think we would want to say that it is, we can still find, this similarity or this rhyming. So one of the comments that someone left on the blog post has had me really thinking, because they compare Jesus' action in the temple, overturning the tables, to the holy rage of Yahweh in the Old Testament, with these kind of like, you know, really classical acts of biblical violence like Sodom and so on. And they wrote, if God himself carries out the act, so be it, but I'm not invested already in some random person's claims to be Yahweh in the context of just violence just because he is Christian. If there is just violence, it must be Yahweh. It cannot be by a flimsy analogy. And this was thought-provoking, but I was like, okay, so what I definitely don't want to be understood to be saying is that you should be invested in anyone's violence just because they are Christian or they claim to act with God or whatever. In fact, that would be hugely problematic. So I immediately tried to push back, but at the same time, it raised an interesting point, which was this that Jesus' action in overturning the temple is kind of in this line of sacred history or something like that. And so, what is the relationship between, whether it's the Haymarket riots and that sacred history? Well, I think that even seeing these folks identify with by analogy, or like have that resonance with the sacred history, like there is something really quite beautiful there, and there's that interesting kind of spark that I see as well in the connection between Durruti's words and carrying the new world in your heart. I think that it's an analogy, but these it's maybe they also bleed over into one another in a certain sense beyond only analogy in like in a sort of abstract sense. So I don't know if that makes sense, but
yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
There's something more going on. Like it's not just a random coincidence, but
Yeah.
there's something kind of spiritually unified there or something.
yeah.
Yeah, like quick note about that though. I have some disdain for that argument that the person in the comments section made. This is probably a dumb thing to start a sentence on a podcast. But, I don't want to wade into the comment section, I guess. But that the idea of like, well, violence can only be justified if it's done by God or something is, I don't know. It's one of those annoying things I remember reading in like John Howard Yoder or something, right? I guess what I don't like about it is that it completely robs the situation of its like context, and just like it talks about violence abstractly. I don't know. Sorry, all that to say, I guess that type of liberal pacifism is something that I can never get behind. It's so frustrating and like kind of misses the point of violence as such. So
Totally. And like, what is the identifier of this more divine violence? Like, how is it ever to be recognized in any context besides like the mythological past?
Yeah, it's like unless God were to create like a pillar of fire or something, there would be no justifiable act of violence anymore in the world.
Yeah, that seems you might be waiting a long time, as it were, or something.
Yeah, for real.
Well, I guess kind of just to wrap the conversation up, it's been a really interesting one. It's cool because we've been talking about violence on the Magnificast since forever. So it's fun to have a conversation. It's fun. I don't know if that's the right word either. It's interesting to have a conversation about violence that's more grounded in like a real event that has just like kind of unfolded. So it's been cool to kind of think about it that way. Well, what do you think that Christians can learn from anarchist direct action? You said that they should pay attention and kind of think about those fault lines, but what's there for Christians if they pay attention?
Right. Good question. So maybe I think two main things. One that we've been kind of talking about and circling around a bunch is that disruptive acts of political theater are already a very deep part of Christian tradition. And attending to that, I think, can help recover Christian history as a living, breathing force, if that makes sense. So that would be one thing. It's sort of that recovery of that disruptive theatrical trajectory of Christian history, like Jesus, and you think of Stephen the proto-martyr, and this kind of like this proliferation of martyrs all of a sudden, like throughout the Roman Empire, people are standing up against this injunction to sort of like bow down before imperial power, and it even unto death, So there's a theatrical component to that, and it's clearly disruptive and sort of jarring. So I think that just reminding ourselves of that part of our own tradition can awaken the way that we use that tradition in our contemporary context, and the way that we appeal to it, maybe, and not. So maybe anarchist direct action can teach us not to forget that, or something. And the second thing that we can learn from direct action by paying attention is, I think, precisely what you pointed to, which is the fault lines in our contemporary social and economic arrangement. I think that anarchist direct action can, in certain cases, I don't want to say this is a universal, but it could pull the mask off of some of the moral discourses that we have accepted in our society, and even, as it were, baptized. So yeah, just some of the discourses around like environmentalism and charity that sort of seem like obvious goods, but when they're read in the context of some of these deeper analyses of the way that capitalism operates, they actually serve as a moral veneer for some really insidious forces. And so I think that one of the things that direct action, at least ideally, could accomplish is calling attention to that. And I mean, is it successful? I think that's something we could discuss, right? And that there's definitely critique of, I mean, the events on Locke Street. Like, I don't want to come off as saying like that I think that they were the greatest or anything, but I just think that we could try and pay attention to these themes, and that, you know, I mean, no one's kind of morally pure here, but that's part of maybe what we could learn as well.
Yeah, I think that's probably one of my favorite things about your article or your essay here, just kind of saying, like, you don't have to necessarily even be an anarchist to understand the value of what's being communicated by anarchism. Like, I'm not an anarchist either, because I'm a Marxist politically.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, like, I think it's really important to understand what anarchists are trying to say, especially in the ways that they're saying it. I mean, there's a lot of other discussions to be had about anarchism and about direct action and all that kind of a thing. But like, one thing that you just can't really deny, I feel like, just with an honest look at anarchism, is that they do expose certain allegiances that are otherwise not exposed. And they do stir up the kind of dust in a way, and they unsettle things, and that dust has to settle again differently. So there's something about that that's just worth kind of paying attention to, and I think that's probably one of my favorite things. I mean, amid all the cool things you do in the essay, just that kind of really basic impulse to be like, well, there's something going on here that you have to kind of attend to, even if it's not something that you would do or something.
Right. Thank you. That was extremely well put. And it makes me feel like I did something cool here.
Yeah, I think so. And it's not just because we go to the same school.
Yeah, it's a side note.
Yeah, that's the full disclosure.
Full disclosure, yeah.
Cool. Well, thanks a lot, Kiegan, for being on the show. It's really nice of you to come on, and it was a great essay for us to read and chat about. I should also say it's really nice for you to do on short notice. Last night, Matt and I were like, what are we going to talk about? And we couldn't figure it out. And then I was like, wait a second, I read something really cool this week, and the guy who read it is my friend, so maybe he'll do it with us. So it's nice to have reliable friends.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on, because I totally listen to your guys' podcast and I love it. So it's nice to be on the other side of things a little bit. I'll be hearing my own voice. I'm sure it'll be awful, but thanks a lot. It's been really fun.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard in this episode, and we know that you did, you should go support us on Patreon, patreon.com/the Magnificast. We're also on all the social media. Just type in the Magnificast and find us, you turkey. Also, special shout out to Critical Mediations, a cool podcast network that we're a part of, and also Theology Corner, another cool podcast network that we're a part of. So definitely go check those networks out. They've all got lots of shows on them. Friendly Anarchism is on both of them, so just go listen to Friendly Anarchism, because, like, why wouldn't you? All right, cool. Thanks. See you next time.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord.